I'm Dr. Greg Chalquist. This is the 8th video for the series on terrapsychological inquiry. To code or not to code the data that you end up with. That's what we're going to look at today. And so the whole piece about data analysis depends on the kind of study you do and what you need that for. So first, a little bit about that word data. It usually gets associated to numbers, things that you can measure. In qualitative research, which includes terrapsychological inquiry, data also can mean contents of texts. It can mean field observations, interview transcripts if you record interviews, personal impressions, body states. We talked about this in a previous video. Dream material. It's a pretty wide area of inquiry. So data is basically results in the raw. So results in the raw, what you end up with after you do the study. Now, if you're doing terrapsychological inquiry primarily as a hermeneutic study, another way of saying that is you're comparing bodies of knowledge to each other, then you might not have a data analysis. It might just be making an argument about why this compares to that or this is different from that. So that's a little different. But if you're using terrapsychological inquiry to interview people, that would be something that you would need some sort of data analysis for. And one nice thing about terrapsychological inquiry is that our data analysis method is built right into the methodology. You don't have to go to a different methodology in order to get data analysis, which you have to for some forms of qualitative inquiry. Also, even if you are doing straight up hermeneutic work, interpretive, comparative, what have you, very often that will involve looking for themes or motifs or recurring images in the work. And if you do that, then you might want something called a thematic analysis. And I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. So data means ultimately in its roots the thing given and what to do with it in a particular study. So if we assume that you were doing a qualitative study in which you actually talk to people and then you have either notes taken or transcripts or whatever, then there's basically four steps that you take with that data, doing it our way. And so the first one has to do with sorting the data and deciding, this is relevant and that's not. So making initial decisions about what belongs and what doesn't belong, especially when you use long conversations to talk to people about something you're studying, or you do quite a lot of homework on some aspect of your research interest, you're going to wind up with a lot of material that you really don't need for your study. What determines this, as I mentioned in the last video, was the research question and the focus. How much focus the research question brings to your study. If it bears on your question, you should keep it, and if it doesn't belong in the study. So sorting is where you make that determination. You put all this aside here and focus on this set of data here, this set of results in the raw. So that's the first step. Next comes coding the data and whether you should do it or not. So coding means assigning categories to different pieces of data, whether that's content of a text or pieces of a conversation or parts of an interview, what have you. So you're assigning categories, you're coding that data in order to look for themes, which we'll get to in a minute. And with a code, one question to ask yourself is, what is this particular sentence, part of a transcript, piece of a text, whatever it is that you're coding, whatever you're using for data, what is this an example of? So for instance, you might be, let's say that you were doing a terrapsychological investigation about people's reactions to tornadoes, just to pick one off the top of my head. So you go talking to people who have lived through tornadoes, towns that have been hit by tornadoes, what have you, and you notice that in the sentences that you pick up from people, in the conversations that you record or in the material that you read, there's this kind of image of swirling around that doesn't stay with the tornado, but it works its way into people's experience. And I don't just mean being caught in a high wind. they might use images and metaphors in their speech that sound like things swirling around. Or it could be some other theme. But anyway, you notice that it's a recurring motif that keeps coming up. So if you were coding that data, you might say image of swirling or image of rotating or whatever it is that comes closest to what you're actually hearing. So that would be an example. And I often think of coding as similar to working with dreams, where if you look especially at a whole series of somebody's dreams, there might be a particular symbol that keeps showing up over and over again. And so the phrase that you create to describe that image or symbol, that's a code, right? Terrapsychological inquiry uses some of the standard coding schemas that qualitative researchers use, but it adds some of its own. So all of this is described in chapter 5 of my book on terrapsychological inquiry. And as with all these videos, I'll leave a link to the publisher's website below. So first sorting, deciding what belongs and what doesn't, and then second coding the data and going through and making sure the codes are what you want them to be in terms of describing what you're actually working with. The third step would be code weaving. And in qualitative research, this refers to putting similar codes together. So you're actually combining codes. So let's say that one of your codes is the theme of swirling, that this keeps coming up in people's conversations. But let's say also that another theme that comes up with people may be a theme of descent. So they may say something like, you know, before the tornado, things were pretty okay in my life. And then afterwards, even though my house wasn't severely damaged, it just seemed like everything was going down. I lost my job, or there were family losses or whatever. And then you hear this in the accounts of several people that you talk to, and you notice, because you're looking for the recurring symbols and themes, that there's this movement of descent in the descriptions that they're giving you. So and all this depends on your research question, but if you were to combine those, because let's say they keep showing up together, first one and then the other. Let's say that people have a lot of swirling or spinning or whatever in the metaphors they use, and then after that a descent. So you might combine them into swirling descent, and then that would condense your data a little bit. What this is leading up to is the fourth step, which is thematic analysis. You could think of a theme as exactly what we're talking about when we look at what the codes are describing. These are recurrent nodes of experience or images or patterns of some kind that structure the kind of thing that you're looking at, whether that's content in text or conversations or what have you. So they're recurring patterns of experience. And in terrapsychological work, we're especially interested in the patterns of experience, the recurring themes and images that link us to what's outside of us. So between inner and outer, between psychological and ecological, literal and symbolic, that kind of thing. Those are the generative themes that we work with. And often one aspect of the theme that you're picking up on is something tangible. Like in my book, I use the example of, let's say, seeds opening in a fire comes up a lot. And then the other might be intangible, something more archetypal, like the theme of rebirth, death and rebirth. So when you look for themes, what you're looking for are the structures that hold people's experience together and that transcend the perceived split between inner and outer. So what you end up with is an account of the themes that bind together the experiences. And then you're able to say, because of these texts I look at, or these people I interviewed, or whatever, these 5 resonances, these 5 guiding images kept coming up in the experience and are probably essential to it somehow. So more on presenting themes in a later video, but the one thing that's important is that you are explicit about how you detect those themes and how they link to the research question. So you need to say somewhere in your report or dissertation or master's thesis or whatever you're doing, why are you looking for those particular themes, or what kind of rationale are you applying such that you pick up on those things? For highly intuitive people, that can sometimes be difficult to articulate because when you're intuitive, you just tend to do that automatically. You just tend to hear, let's say you're hearing a conversation and, the image of water keeps coming up, or you're watching something and, a certain motif keeps recurring. You tend to do that automatically and just pick it right up. So it takes some extra effort that's worthwhile to actually lead people through the steps of this is why I'm detecting this resonance, this recurring theme in the material that I'm looking at. So that's very important. And then the second thing I'll mention is that every step of the way, as a check on whatever projections you bring to the work, as a correction for what you miss, you need to be doing this data analysis with other people if you choose to do data analysis. You need to have other people involved. So that could look like a research committee going over your coding and thematizing and just checking over your shoulder to make sure that it doesn't look like a bias has been introduced somehow, some unconscious bias, something that's distorting the picture of what's happening. Another way of doing this is to involve whoever you talk to in the coding process right from the very beginning, sorting and coding. And another way of doing it that takes a little bit less time is to actually give them a distillation of the themes that came up in the material they gave you, and then ask them, am I getting at the structures or at the essence or the inner meaning of what you told me? Does this resonate for you? And that would be a way of doing it as well. So involving others as active participants in the research. So you move from just a bunch of data, a bunch of impressions, bits and pieces, fragments of homework, images running all over the place, a whole mass of things that can confuse you at the beginning. You start there, and then through data analysis, you wind up with more of the core of a picture or a story about the inner meaning of what you're actually looking at. And at that point, you're ready to present it, which we'll talk about in another video.